What we're going to do today is we're going to finish up. I'll have a few kind of closing thoughts on the life of Calvin and Servetus that I want to just maybe discuss with you and hear your feedback as well. And then I want to get into the last days of Calvin's life, really his declining health and then his death. And then we'll close, and I don't know how long it'll take us, maybe into part of next week, but then just some closing thoughts on the life of Calvin. What did we learn from his life? I mean, there's a ton we can learn from his theology and his institutes and all of that, but what about the way that he lived? How did he apply his theology? How did his thinking shape him, and what did we learn from all of that? So I want to get into that. But as I got to thinking about Calvin's age and his death, I thought the words of Psalm 90 were appropriate. I won't read the whole psalm, but Psalm 90 it was written by Moses, and in some ways, Calvin himself drew some parallels between himself and Moses near the end of his life. There are some things that, not maybe in the sense that you might think, but in terms of actually their humility. Calvin, as you're going to see, did not want to draw a lot of attention to himself, not only in his life, but even in his death. He really did not want, he didn't want people memorializing him, actually. So the fact that we're holding a class on Calvin, I think he might even be a little uncomfortable with, to be honest with you. But Moses writes this psalm, and he's reflecting on his own life, it seems. And part of what he does is he writes these words down, which are kind of meant to help us think about the brevity of life and what do we do with that. So Psalm 90, I'll read verses 9 through about 13, 14, somewhere in there. It says this: "For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on us, your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands." Calvin himself, I think, could have written those words. You hear that sense of life is short, it's difficult, it's filled with pain. Calvin experienced that probably more than any of us ever will have to, probably. And yet he's praying for the wisdom. Moses is, and I think Calvin would have echoed this as well. Moses is praying for that wisdom to recognize that if you know that life is short, what do you do with that? And he concludes with those words of asking that God would establish the work of his hands. Take the work that he has done and use that for his glory. And that certainly would have been Calvin's prayer. Calvin, that was first and foremost in his mind, in his ministry, was that God would use his work for his own glory and not for Calvin's glory and for Calvin's accolades. So, in that sense, fitting words, I think, for Calvin. I want to close devotions, open this, with some words that, they'll sound extra Calvinistic, I suppose, at least in the stereotypical sense of it. The prayer is called Our Own Ruin. And so it has this sort of foreboding sense about it, but it's really a prayer of recognizing the brevity of our own life and our own frailty as human beings. And, again, as our culture, we are a death-denying culture. We spend an awful lot of money every year trying to look and stay young. Just we value youth more than we tend to value age, and in that sense, I think we tend to avoid facing our own mortality, and yet teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom, and our own ruin. These are themes that were maybe more familiar in bygone years. So let's open then with this prayer from Calvin. Let's have Calvin lead us in prayer. Grant, Almighty God, that as we were from our beginning lost, when thou wert pleased to extend to us thy hand, and to restore us to salvation for the sake of thy Son, and that as we continue even daily to run headlong to our own ruin, O grant that we may not, by sinning so often, so provoke at length thy displeasure as to cause thee to take away from us thy mercy thou hast hitherto exercised toward us, and through which thou hast adopted us. But by thy Spirit destroy the wickedness of our heart, and restore us to a sound mind, that we may ever cleave to thee with a true and sincere heart, that being forfeited by thy defense we may continue safe even amidst all kinds of danger, until at length thou gatherest us into that blessed rest which has been prepared for us in heaven by our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so keep that in mind as we get into the talking about the death and the last days of Calvin. But before we get there, I want to just maybe draw a few conclusions from the life and death of Michael Servetus and Calvin's role in all of that. I don't think I touched last week on the legacy of Servetus. So in fairness to Michael Servetus, a theologian he was not. Well, a good theologian he was not. He was a theologian, an amateur one. He was not trained in theology, but he dabbled in it, and he did an awful lot of writing. He would, I think, maybe be the equivalent of a blogger today, a well-known blogger who liked to publish stuff, but maybe didn't have the training or the expertise in it. His theological legacy actually lives on by way of Unitarianism today. Now, I don't know that it's fair to say that Servetus created Unitarianism, but you will find strands of his, even references to him in certain Unitarian writings. It's not like Servetus' relationship to Unitarianism is not like Calvin's relationship to Reformed theology. It's not that strong, if that makes sense. But you could say that his fingerprints are on it. And so this idea that there's only one God and the Trinity is nonsense, and that, if you believe the Trinity, you believe a three-headed devil. That was Servetus' view, and that's, you'll find that in Unitarianism, in the Unitarian movement as well. The Unitarian movement is pretty light on theology. They would tell you they believe the Bible, but it's a very loose interpretation, and there's a lot of other things along with that they would probably include in their beliefs. So I'm not sure that Unitarian theology is all that rich or deep, but it's there, and Servetus has had some influence on it. So his thinking is still kind of part of that. The other, I think if he had stuck to medicine, Servetus would have been remembered a lot more positively. He actually was pretty remarkable as a physician. He mapped out the human circulatory system, and obviously his thought has, what he had started has developed a lot more since then, but he really is the father of the modern understanding of the human circulatory system. And so in that sense, he had a very positive impact on human nature, but unfortunately he wasn't content to stay in his lane, so to speak, and so his dabbling in theology probably sullied his reputation. So in that sense, he did have some positive contributions. Like I said, unfortunately, he kind of stepped out of his lane, and it's never really a good idea. So, but the question is, how do we analyze it? How do we make sense of not only Calvin's role in this, but also how do we evaluate the whole episode, the whole affair, as it's sometimes called, the Servetus affair? I think there's one thing, and I've mentioned this a few times, and I'll keep mentioning because I think it's important, and that's the idea of chronological snobbery. Are any of you familiar with that term? Okay, so this is an idea of C.S. Lewis's, that's what he called it, where people in one time and place can look backwards on a time 50, 100, 500 years past and be so appalled by the thinking and the practices of that time that there's this kind of pride that says we would never do that. We are above that. And in one sense, I mean, there's some truth in that, right? We look back on this, and hopefully as you heard me kind of describe Servetus and the whole event, hopefully you have thought of, that was a bad thing, right? I don't want you thinking, oh, it's good, they executed a heretic, good for them. No, but I also want us to remember that if a person with a mind as sharp as Calvin and the many others, Pharaoh, Verret, others in that time, if they took that course of action, what makes us so confident that if we were in that time, we would have never done something like that? Do you see what I'm getting at? And so we always have to be really careful that as we evaluate history, as we evaluate decisions made in the past and actions and trends and cultural movements and so on, we should evaluate it as honestly as we can, but we have to do it with a lot of humility. We have to do it with the mindset that starts out saying, if I were in that time and place, I probably would have done the exact same thing. Now, that doesn't keep us from being honest and thoughtful about how we view history, but it keeps us from the pride that says, I'm better than my ancestors, I'm smarter than them, I'm more refined and more intelligent than them. There's a certain pride that can creep in that's not conducive to good history. So let's not sit in a place of judgment in that sense. Let's sit in a place of humility and thoughtful evaluation. But remember that we have the benefit that they didn't have. We have the benefit of 500 years since then of thought and learning, and the way that history, or the way that thought changes and theology changes and adapts. So we have to have that sort of humility about that. Does that make sense? You kind of see what we're getting at? Yeah, Michael.
I was reading a book called Clear Thinking by somebody who used to be in intelligence and now writes for the general consumption, and he said, make sure whenever you're making a good decision that you're in a good position. I thought, what? What are you talking about, a good position? The position we have today is better than the position Calvin was offering.
Yeah, right.
We have a better context in which to work,
Right.
so I have the odds of making good
Right.
choices because the system is working better
Right.
for me. But
Right.
when I don't sit and say, okay, this is the scenario, what choices would I have? I'll choose that one. No, that's
Yeah.
not an option.
Yeah, right.
What do you mean it's not an option?
Right.
It's not an option.
Exactly right.
It's,
Exactly right.
Oh, yeah, gotta hope that it's
Yeah.
better for our children and their children.
Right. We assume that they're playing with the same deck of cards, as it were.
They got like 12 cards.
And right, exactly. We've got exactly. That's a really good way to put it, and an important lesson for us. And again, it doesn't stop us from evaluating, but it keeps us humble as we do it, and it reminds us that they did not have options that we would have today. So yeah, good point. The other thing I think to remember and keep in mind is that in those days they took heresy a lot more seriously. Now, I want us to take heresy seriously. I don't want us beheading people or burning them at the stake over it, but I want us to take it seriously. But back then they took it far more seriously than probably we do today. Today you hear heresy and we tend to downplay it. We tend to think of it as, well, that's a nice opinion that you have, and I have a different opinion, and it's all good. Again, I'm glad we're not burning people for it, but I also want us to maybe learn that lesson from them. That's maybe something they have to teach us, that false teaching, it is a big deal. And so then it kind of becomes, how do we integrate these two ideas together? How do we have the humility that says, we don't want to burn people at the stake. We don't want to go to that extreme, but we also want to learn from them the seriousness with which they took false teaching and the destructive power that it could have. So how do we kind of bring that together so that we're humble about it, but truth? So it's always that tension of truth and grace that we have to hold together. Adrian.
When you're speaking before a group of people, you can be 100% sure in your brain that what you're saying is true, but you don't have to admit it. I mean, you can use words like, well, I'm 49% sure about this, and I'm...
Right.
You need to stay out of trouble, you need to stop using words like, I'm absolutely positive,
Yeah.
or I'm 100% sure. You can,
Right.
need to avoid those kind of phrases in order to
Yeah, good
protect
point.
yourself.
Good point. Sometimes just the choice of language that we use can go a long ways towards communicating that posture of humility. And I think we have, I've wrestled with this too, like, on a lot of issues, if you hold a position on an issue, most of us think that we're 100% right in all of our convictions, right? Because if you thought you were wrong about something, you'd change your point of view, right? So, but we have to keep it in our mind, this is what I think, although it's possible I'm wrong. And like what you're saying, sometimes just communicating that by saying, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is right, but, maybe not 100% certain, or maybe I'm, mistaken.
And
Yeah.
another belief system behind what I just said is that what you're doing is you're telling the people in your audience that they can make their own decision about your theory, whether it's
Yeah.
crazy or true or whatever.
Right. And I think a lot of times today people are not, and there's both a good and bad side of this, people are not persuaded nearly as much by argumentation today, right? In other words, if we disagree on something, how many of you, any of you familiar with Jonathan Haidt? He wrote a really intriguing book. He wrote Fuel.
Generation?
Yeah, well, Anxious Generation is like 100% must read if you want to understand the problem with social media and that. But he also wrote a book. He wrote about the happiness hypothesis. He wrote, I forget the name of it now, but he wrote a book about basically how do people change their minds and their opinions on things. And he said a lot of times we appeal to people's brain, to their thinking, when really that's not how people change their minds. People don't reason their way into new thinking. They almost feel their way into it. And he fleshes that out. It's a little less squishy than I'm making it sound, but it's not, it's still kind of like, it gets this idea that if we want to change people's mind, we have to learn not to just present argumentation. We have to learn to appeal to the person. And, again, do with that what you will. There's good and bad to that. Sometimes just being aware of it is a helpful first step. Yeah, maybe we wish people were a little more reasoned in their thinking, but they aren't. So, yeah, David.
And of course, the great, as a word, heresy today is to say that my position is the truth.
That's right.
That's probably
Yeah.
even worse than using the wrong pronouns.
Right.
But last night I was reading my Christmas card, and one of my cousins, he was talking about all his church activities and out of his family and so forth. Unfortunately, it's in the Latter-day Saints.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, good point. Especially what you're saying about the idea of heresy. We throw that word, in church circles, we tend to throw that word around a lot. I've had conversations with people who have a disagreement about a relatively minor issue. It might be something like end times or infant baptism, whatever, something comparatively minor, and they use the word heresy for it. Well, we have to be really careful. A heresy is something that denies the essential truths of the gospel. It's not a theological disagreement. In other words, a person can be in error without being a heretic. Does that make sense? And that's an important distinction to make. Our denomination, within the last couple of years, actually completed a study and a report on that, because there's some people that were sensing that everything was a heresy. It's like, well, no. Let's rein that in a little bit. Let's be a little more precise with our language. So, all right. I want to just make a couple more observations. First of all, the problem of church and state relationships. We've said this quite a number of times. This whole episode illustrates that challenge of when church and state function, we might even say codependently, or in a way that's not super healthy. The church is controlling the state, and the state is doing the work of or the church is doing the work of the state, and how to pull that apart. This was not pulled apart. This was a pretty tightly bound together system that I think was not healthy, and I think it violated Calvin's own convictions. And because if you read about how Calvin sees the distinctions between the church and the state, I've tried to come to grips with this in my own mind, because on the one hand he says the church, the spiritual authority of the church is here, and the authority of the state is here, and they function. They're not isolated, but they function independently, and then yet you see in Geneva, like, they're functioning pretty, almost one and the same at some times. So, and again, I think that's because, the Calvin had his theology and his understanding, but he also had to deal with the reality that was. And so that, maybe over time it was one of his bucket list items is to let's pull those apart more, and he just didn't get time to do it, or I don't exactly know. But anyways, this whole event shows how that can go wrong. Final thoughts are just being fair to Calvin in all of this, meaning Calvin really takes a black eye on this, and I think some of that is justified, right? He played a part in this that was regrettable. It's in a perfect world we would look back and say, Calvin, be the crusader of change here and oppose all this, but he's not. He's a product of his time, but there's still culpability there, I think. And so, the good side of that is, like I said last week, it keeps us from hagiography, which is just sort of, it's literally saint writing. It's when we look back at people and we gloss over all their shortcomings and we emphasize all of their successes and their good things. Good history doesn't do that. Good history is honest about people's flaws and faults and failures, and this allows us to do that. And the reason that's a good thing is because it reminds us there's one perfect person in all of church history, and Calvin needed Jesus just like we do, and so it's regrettable. It reminds us that Calvin was he was a flawed sinner too, and he was broken in need of God's grace and forgiveness, and those are the kinds of people God deals with, thankfully, because we all need that, right? So okay, that's a good thing. Yeah, Michael.
Earlier when you were describing his role in this, I thought I remembered you saying he was a witness.
Yes, he was. I would say he was a star witness. So,
if he has to be a witness, my guess is he couldn't refuse.
yeah, I don't know about. He probably could have. Again, this is us looking 500 and some odd years, or 450 some odd years back. He probably could have pushed back more on. In terms of what the state would have wanted to do, but yeah, I don't know. He was at times pretty pointed in what he was saying about Servetus as well, and so
His question is just if he's saying his concerns about him theologically, why does he take a black eye for a state decision? Like what practically would people say practically he could have done?
That's a question for discussion, because Calvin's worst critics will assign him blame for everything. They'll point to Calvin and say, look, he had this guy executed. And that's not accurate. Now, I think a fair writing of history would say, well, he was a star witness, but he maybe could have done more to fight the idea of execution. Now, again, in Calvin's defense, he actually appealed for a more humane execution for him. He ministered to Servetus in his last hours, even though Servetus kind of said, you know what, I don't want you visiting me right now. Farel was allowed to stay, Calvin was sent home. So I think he was an expert witness, but I think he was doing it, we might say, with a bias towards the outcome that the city wanted, and others in Switzerland as well. There were other Swiss leaders and Swiss cantons that also wanted, when they gave their advice, they said, yeah, he needs to be put to death. So that's a question that history has debated. What could Calvin have done anything different, and if so, what? Again, speculating from our armchair 450 years later, right? It's easy to do, but in the moment it would have been hard.
Last week you said that it was Calvin who sort of turned him in and said, hey, this is Servetus guy. There's where, because he was acting under his understanding that if I don't say something, I'm aiding and abetting the Servetus, right? So Servetus was already a marked man in France. There was a warrant out for his arrest, and then Servetus comes and shows up in church, and essentially is flaunting it too. Like he's basically daring people to do something. And so Calvin, if I could put myself in Calvin's shoes, I think that Calvin said, look, I can't just let this go. Or everybody knows this is Servetus and I'm not doing anything about it, then everybody's going to look at me and say, you let him go, you let him off the hook. And I think Calvin knew he couldn't do that either. So he did turn him in. And that's where, maybe, again, our armchair 450 years later, oh, Calvin, you should have had mercy. I know that that works out quite like that, so. Ryan?
I think it seems pretty clear in terms of the ideas that they represented. Calvin was very bold in his
Mhm.
opposition,
Yeah.
but it's more where I think people disagree is what were his personal feelings towards him?
Yeah.
Was it,
Yeah.
hey, he was visiting him and tried to be compassionate, or was he the driving force and there was this personal enmity
Right.
between
Right, and how, that's where, to me, it's like, it's some gray area in there, like, so he visits Servetus in Servetus's final hours, he does a pastoral visit, and even during the course of the trial, he visits Servetus, and what does he do? He gives him a stack of books to read, you know, it's like, hey, I care for you, brother, read these, and maybe these will make you, you know, well, I don't know, you know, is that compassion? Maybe it is, maybe, you know, again, it's thought-provoking.
Well, in his own way, he was trying to, maybe not as gently as possible, because his time was short, so to
Mhm.
speak, correct him. Like,
Yeah,
want
right.
you to not be on that wrong path,
Right,
and to not be
right.
headed for.
I think that's right. I think if Calvin had his way, Servetus would have repented early enough
Right.
to have effected a
to
different
turn that
outcome.
around, Yeah.
And part of it too is, you know, because we've all talked here, and I've said it, and you've said it, we sort of want Calvin to have been a little nicer about it. Well, welcome to the 21st century, right? We are a niceness culture. We really, you know, to a fault at times. Back then, they were more direct, and especially in Swiss culture. If you've been to, you know, Western Europe, Switzerland, France, Holland, if any of you have any familiarity with the Dutch, you know that tact is not high on the list of cultural values, and directness is. And so, yeah, how much of this is culture, and for us in an American setting where we tend to, you know, we all want people to be nice, and, you know, well, some of that's our own culture.
Well, and some of it is really hard for us in our, like you were saying, in our, like, we live in 2024. We have all of these freedoms and rights
Mhm.
that we're not part of that.
That's
In sixth
right.
grade, where they're learning about feudalism right now, that, well, that's not fair. You're right, but you're thinking
right.
like a sixth
That's
grader
right.
in 2024. You're not thinking
That's
like
right.
someone in the 10th century.
Right, check your privilege. No, I,
There are times where they're like, but,
Right.
I'm like, but,
That's right.
no.
right.
And we role play for this whole time, so they
Yeah.
really,
That's right, we
And that's what I was thinking.
have it pretty good,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, basically, everybody has advantages that would have been unheard of 500,000 years ago. I think Jen, you were about
Yeah,
to say
I was
something.
just gonna say, Servetus did stand him up for that debate too. So
Yeah,
there's probably
right.
A little bit of like,
Right.
I don't know.
Servetus is not an innocent victim here at all. He not only, so he arranges this time, and Calvin takes great risk at meeting Servetus there, except for Servetus, you know, no show, no call. It's like, okay. And then he does things throughout his life to just twist the knife a little bit. He really, you know, he was one of these guys that was just basically daring people to do something about this. And so he's not off the hook either. We can't paint Calvin, you know, we aren't, but it's not fair to paint Calvin as this monster and Servetus as this poor victim that everybody was chasing around, and he wasn't doing anything wrong. No, it's not like that at all. Yeah, Adrian.
With Martin Luther King, when he was alive, he was considered by a lot of people to be a troublemaker, and yet now we have a national holiday for
That's
Martin
right.
Luther King.
That's right. Sometimes the benefit of history changes our perspective a lot. We can say that about, well, lots of people that in the moment were really despised, and now, you know, their credibility has gone up quite a bit. So, okay, so much for that. I want to take you a little bit into the last days of Calvin's life. We'll spend just a little time about this, and then that'll time out well. So I said this at the beginning of our class back in September when I was introducing Calvin. Calvin was not really a healthy person. A lot of that had to do with his own genetics and, you know, his own just, you know, his own physical makeup. Some of it had to do with poor choices. So in his life, Calvin dealt with gout, asthma, digestive problems, poor eyesight, migraines, pleurisy, tuberculosis, hemorrhoids, for which he went horseback riding as a way of treating them. Go figure. I would not advise that course of treatment. I'm not a doctor, but doesn't seem helpful to me. Kidney stones, gallstones, influenza, and arthritis, but other than that, he was in great shape. So this guy, you get the sense that not, you know, and from that list, I would say one of those things, all of them were not really anything he could have done much about. The hemorrhoids probably didn't help by, taking the horse out and taking it for a ride to try to cure that problem. But he dealt with all those things, and they were not anything that, he could have done anything about. Nowadays, if you have asthma, you take an inhaler with you, and hopefully if you have a flare-up, you use your inhaler. Yeah, Michael.
How would his health have compared to the health of the people around him?
I was just wondering that.
I think lower than average. Our healthcare today is amazingly good.
Yeah.
Compared to history, compared to around the world. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole debate about the healthcare system. I'm just talking about in terms of, if you've got a problem, generally speaking, I was listening, there's something like 6,000 possible physical conditions that a person can have, and there's something like 2,000 possible medications that they can prescribe. So it's, we've got access to a lot of expertise and knowledge. By some arguments, we have, our problem in healthcare is not that we don't have enough knowledge. We've got this massive amount of knowledge. We don't know everything yet, but we have a massive amount of knowledge. We don't always know how to apply it and implement it as well as we could, but the knowledge is there. Well, back then, the knowledge wasn't there. And so, you have gout. Well, nowadays we know that that's, uric acid that collects in the joints, and it's really, really painful, I'm told. Digestive problems, we know that there's a lot of different causes for that, and hence we can treat a lot of that. If you have heartburn, you take, what is it? There's Prilosec or whatever else, and it shuts off the stomach pumps that pump the acid, and they've got all kinds of pretty simple cures when you think about it. Well, back then they didn't have any of that, and so you get sick. You try some of your own remedies, and that's actually what Calvin did. Calvin, if Calvin, I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but if Calvin were around today, he'd be one of those guys that, I did my own research and, went on the web and found this site. And so he came up with all these ways of treating his various ailments that we look at today and say, what? But again, product of his time, etc. So he only ate 1 meal per day, and he thought that would help. Now, maybe if you've got acid reflux or, I can kind of understand only eating 1 meal per day. But what he chose to eat, I didn't write it down, I forgot, but what he chose to eat was not very good. I think he only ate, I want to say he only ate certain kinds of vegetables and no protein, and just not a good diet. We look at, he'd need to meet with a registered dietitian today, I think, because just didn't eat very well. He didn't sleep very well. He'd stay up really, really late at night. He'd get up super early in the morning. He slept 4 hours a day. That was it. He didn't take naps. There was no siesta for him. He did not enjoy a lot of recreation. And now you might look at that and say, well, that's good. But no, recreation's important. You need to have time to, take a step back from the homework and the studying and so on. Calvin didn't do that except for very, very occasionally. There was a game, I forget the name of the game, he'd play that with some friends. Very occasionally he'd enjoy a social outing, but not very often. And so his life was heavily focused on church work, pastoral work, which, obviously we've benefited greatly from that, but today we might say, what would it look like for you to work a Sabbath into your busy routine? Take a day off once a week or something. He did it, even as his health declined near the end of his life, he didn't stop working. He actually continually, even up to the very last day of his life, he was dictating notes and thoughts and sermon notes and things of that sort. And when he couldn't go to church, he would be carried to church. The elders of the church would come. Maybe they formed a committee, who knows, right? It could be the Calvin Carrying Committee, and they would come and they would carry him in that chair there, and they would walk him. It's, I think I showed you at one point, it's maybe, I don't know, it's not very far, maybe a third of a mile at most from his home to the church. And they would carry him along, and then he would just preach from his chair. So he would, the pulpit was, you'd have to go up a pretty steep staircase to get to the pulpit. And if he was sick enough, he wouldn't do that. I think my understanding is he would just preach from the chair on the ground floor. But it was not easy for him, especially as his health declined near the end of his life. The thing that I find remarkable about that is that Calvin seemed to embrace the suffering. And I don't mean he was just kind of stoic and in denial about it. I mean that his understanding of the cross and about the Christian life was that Christians should expect to suffer. He believed that the Christian life, Christians were not immune to the problem of pain. And so he received that even as not, I don't know that he'd call it a gift from God, but he received it as a providence of God. So he said something, I did put it up there. Oh, thou, O Lord, bruises me, but it is enough for me that it is thy hand. Now just think about that a minute. I don't know how when I get sick, I can be kind of a baby about it, right? You just kind of whine and complain, oh, why me? And Calvin said, no, this is from the Lord, and even when the Lord allows us, or even in Calvin I think would go as far as saying causes this to us, we can nevertheless trust that a gracious God is behind this, and a gracious God that allows and permits and causes suffering has a reason and a purpose for it, and one that is redemptive. Now we're going to dig more into that idea later on, because when we talk about Calvin's theology of providence, we're going to have to wrestle with that idea. To what extent does God cause and what extent does he permit? There's a difference there, and Calvinists have debated a lot about that. Like here's where Calvin was on it, and there's some Calvinists that say, well, maybe Calvin went too far on that. And so it's a fascinating debate. To what extent does God cause suffering? To what extent is he just permitting it to happen? And we'll wade into those waters when we get into his theology of providence. Calvin preached his last sermon in February 1564. So by this time his health was pretty poor. He was still doing his best, but he on this Sunday he was carried into the church for the last, he attended church still, but he was carried to preach for the last time, February 6th of 1564. A couple months later, about 6 weeks later, on April 2nd, that was Easter Sunday, he actually attended church at St. Pierre's for the last time. It was Easter Sunday. And he was brought to church again. I'm sure they carried him again. By this time, his successor, Theodore Beza, was largely stepping into the role that Calvin had previously had. And so Beza served communion to Calvin. Calvin received the sacrament from his successor. 3-4 weeks later, on April 25, he dictated his last will and testament. Now, it wasn't a very long dictation because Calvin didn't have a whole lot to his name. He died essentially in poverty, so he didn't have a lot to leave behind to anybody. Very few earthly possessions, but whatever it was that he had, he dictated that, and thus kind of was making his own preparations. He clearly knew that the end was near for him. He on April 27th. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me pause, and this might be actually a good time to, we're a little early, but rather than trying to rush through this last part, let me pause and ask if there are any questions or thoughts on just his declining health, and then we can wrap it up here. We'll pick it up next week.
How old was he?
60. Well, he was born in 1509, so he was July 1509, so he would have been 63 almost. Wait, my math is always really bad. I think he was 64 or 54, right? Yeah, 54, almost 55. He would have been had he lived till July. He died in May of 1564. So not very old. I mean, lifetime expectancy back then was older than that. You got to keep in mind life expectancy factors in a very high infant mortality rate. So if you survive infancy, statistically, if you exclude infancy, the infant mortality is higher than it actually would be. Does that make sense? So if you include infant mortality, that infant mortality pulls the average down. So if you survive infancy, you actually, you live to. I think Farrell lived into his. I think he was 80 something. Beza was also, lived a pretty good long life. So comparatively, Calvin died even for his age. He died young. It's kind of sobering because he's 10 years older than me than I am now, and I think, Calvin's done an awful lot with his life, and I think, I like to stay busy, but boy, anyway.
You're sure no trouble in Geneva.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Didn't have as much difficulty, I guess. Any other questions or thoughts on that? So we'll wrap it up here, and then next week I'll kind of talk you through his death. There's kind of I find it kind of a moving story of how he concluded his life, and then we'll finish with some
closing reflections on what do we learn from the life of Calvin, and see if we can draw some themes together. Let's pray together. Our Lord and our God, we thank you for the life of your servant John Calvin. Again, we've got a lot to learn from him. We have the benefit of many, many years of wisdom since that time. And so it helps us to be humble, and it's a good reminder for us that all of your servants, all of the people that you've used throughout history are imperfect. They're flawed people, affected by sin, their own personal sin, but also the sins of the world around them. And yet, nevertheless, we see your power at work in each of them, and Calvin was certainly no exception to that. We thank you for that. Thank you for the ways that we benefit from him even today, some 500 years later. As we continue the rest of our days, we move into our worship together. We ask your blessing on our time together, that it may nourish and sustain us for our walk with you. In Christ, amen.